Hello and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the ELEEP webinar on California State Climate Change Adaptation Policy, very broadly speaking, or Climate Adapt in California. I'm very happy that you found the time to join us here today. I see people are still coming in. I will very briefly introduce myself. I'm Max Grunig. I think all of you know that already. And I work for the Ecologic Institute here in Washington, D.C. We're a think tank for environmental policy. And we do work together with the Atlantic Council and the Ecologic Institute in Berlin on the Emerging Leaders in Environmental and Energy Policy Network, short ELEEP. You also all know this already. Other people on the call are actually very familiar with the network. And we do have a very special guest here today with us. And I want to introduce you very briefly. Joey Wall, thank you very much for joining us here today and for presenting for the network members and the friends of the network about California climate adaptation strategies and policies. I have to make an announcement at this point. We initially had a second speaker scheduled for today, and that was Michael McCormick, also from California, also speaking on the same topic. He unfortunately had to cancel I have to say, well, last minute due to urgent matters that he had to attend to. However, we are very happy that Joey Wall is here and we'll try. I'm not saying you're not replacing Michael McCormick, but you're trying to cover some of his topics as well. So all of you on the call, so we will, of course, we improvise a little bit because this was not planned, this change. This really happened a few minutes before this webinar. So please also be a little bit forgiving if maybe we can't cover all of it, all the aspects that you want to have covered. I also asked, we might have possibly a follow-up webinar at some other point in time later. But if not, otherwise, we can definitely also be in touch. And a lot of you, not all of you, but a lot of you will also be with us for the study tour next week to California to study what this actually all means in practice on the ground. We will, however, not go to where Joey and Michael are, to Sacramento, but we'll just go to the LA area. So this will be our only opportunity to interact with Joey and, well, Michael not now, but with Joey is today. And with that, I also have to make another announcement. For those of you who will join the tour next week, we initially had planned a dinner on Sunday with Michael McCormick to kind of follow up on the webinar. And in a matter unrelated to the cancellation of the webinar on his side, now he also had to change his travel plan, so he won't be there at the dinner. Just to sum this up, so no Michael McCormick, but Joey Wall is here today, and thank you very much for taking the time for also being ready to answer our questions. So for all of you, you're all muted by default. You know these webinars, so by now you've seen a few, so you can't talk right now. We will first let Joey talk and present. And then after that, you can, we will open the Q&A session and you can ask questions, and I can actually open your microphone. So you have three ways of signaling that you would like to talk. You can raise your hand, you can also ask a question, or you can send a chat. Please be a little bit forgiving if I don't see anything right away. It's not that I don't want to have you speak, but it's maybe because there are other things happening in parallel. Don't worry. you're not being overlooked, you're being heard, and then I will open the microphone. I will ask you to speak. If you don't have a microphone, if you can't talk, I can also just read out your questions. So don't worry about that part. With that being said, this session is also being recorded. So if you want to rewatch anything later or want to share the webinar with anybody later on, this will be totally possible. So now I've already exhausted 5 minutes of our 60. This is kind of outrageous. So I want to be quiet now, and I want to hand over to Joey. Joey, I also made you a presenter so you can share your screen anytime you feel like it. I will now go into hiding and leave the stage to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Max. And hi, everybody. Yeah, like Max said, I'm Joey Wall. It's great to be able to present on this and talk about California's adaptation policy. With Michael being out, I'm sort of quickly trying to sketch out a plan of attack to cover some of the higher level points. I am one of the leads at the Natural Resources Agency on the state's adaptation plan comprehensively across state departments and agencies to respond to climate impacts in all different areas. In general, that's just a piece of the larger state strategy on climate adaptation and climate in general. So before jumping into the webinar, I'm just going to talk really quickly about some of the things that Michael was going to cover in terms of the broad overview of state climate policy and how that interacts with local and regional governments. Then I'll get into my prepared presentation. And at the end of that, I think I'll respond to some of the issues that are common themes in both of the areas that Michael was going to cover, as well as the Safeguarding California Plan adaptation strategy component that I'll cover later. So I don't know if there's any more background needed, but I'm just going to jump right in. I talked to Julia and Adam, or emailed with Julia and Adam before this webinar about what would be most useful and helpful, and it sounds like everyone has a pretty good understanding of this area of policy and are more interested in sort of the California-specific elements of climate change adaptation, and I'll try to jump right into a broad policy overview. And one of the frameworks the state of California has used for climate change adaptation is the 3 R's: reducing emissions, research, and readiness, or resilience, or reducing risk as that 3rd R, which would be this adaptation policy space. And obviously the reducing emissions is the big focus of most of the state government activity, with the scoping plan and the 2020, 2030, and 2050 emissions reduction targets. There's a lot of really exciting policy on that side. I'm not going to talk about much of that, but I think this reducing risk or readiness element has gotten sort of a later start. The initial executive order from Governor Schwarzenegger that set out the still standing 2020 and 2050 emissions reduction targets was issued in 2005. He issued an adaptation focused executive order in 2008, and the corresponding legislation to put adaptation activities into statute hasn't really happened until just 2 years ago. So there's a lot less focus, and there's a lot less going on in some ways, but in other ways it touches every part of state government and is trying to be an integrated and comprehensive part of how just government works. And since I mentioned the two Schwarzenegger executive orders in 2005 and 2008, that still, in a lot of ways, echo throughout how the state is approaching climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll also mention Governor Brown's big climate-focused executive order B3015, which set 2030 emissions reduction targets, as well as a whole host of adaptation related initiatives into play. And it's a really interesting executive order that ties together response to drought at the time, the climate impacts that we continue to see, as well as the steep emissions reductions targets that have really been at the forefront of California leading mitigation here in the United States. One of the big pieces that Michael works on at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is coordinating these high-level state adaptation prerogatives with local and regional governments. So he, just to give a brief framework of some of the informal and formal pieces of the local and regional and state collaboration around climate change adaptation. We have the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation here in California. That's a really interesting project. They're coalitions of groups in San Diego, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Sacramento, and the Sierra Nevada regions of California. And they organize efforts within those regions, seek to fund and enact adaptation solutions, and coordinate and assist with the development of state adaptation policy. One of the big pieces that has assisted with this integration of local and regional action with state policy is a law that was passed 2 years ago, SB 379, which requires local governments to include climate adaptation in their general plans. So the land use and functional planning for local governments needs to address climate impacts, which is a pretty new and exciting step that's really going to be pushing forward what the state is doing on climate adaptation. And part of what Michael works on are the guidelines and guidance to local governments around how to do adaptation planning. The state did put out an adaptation planning guide in 2012, as well as a web tool called CalAdapt, caladapt.org, which is a really fascinating resource. I know Adam is going to present more on how they have utilized that tool at Southern California Edison on your tour later this week. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but the state has really built an ecosystem of resources and communication with local and regional governments, because that's where a lot of the adaptation has to happen. And the comprehensive or the holistic impact of climate change on so many different parts has to be responded to with integrated action, and that's what local governments do a lot better than state government. The last piece that Michael is really the expert on, and not me, is sort of how federal policy interacts with state policy in the adaptation space. And I know people are always interested to see what the new administration will do to progress in this space. With all due respect to Michael, who has worked at the federal, or who did work with the federal government on climate adaptation, I don't think it actually that the federal administration transition changes too much of what's happening on the ground here in California. I feel like we're in general much further along, and the resources that we have are uh, much better developed and targeted to California than what was available at the federal level, and still is. They haven't taken most of those resources down yet, and those have all been archived. But the uh, federal government really is most crucial in terms of supporting the adaptation-related climate research. And I think that's going to be a huge question of how we continue the climate research going forward without that federal support. So that's basically what Michael was going to talk about. So I'll jump into my presentation on safeguarding California. It's pretty short, and it's really just an outline to help me talk through some of the important points. Like I said before, safeguarding California is sort of the tagline or phrase that we use to describe the state's adaptation plan. I'll get into why in a little bit. The state's climate adaptation plan has gone through several different names, and it might be helpful just to understand to the evolution of climate adaptation policy and why it's somewhat complicated to talk about how California has developed climate adaptation policy since 2008 and Governor Schwarzenegger's initial executive order on adaptation, because there's been a lot of different approaches. In response to Governor Schwarzenegger's 2008 executive order, the Natural Resources Agency put together a plan called the 2009 California Climate Adaptation Strategy, and that was a really great initial strategy for approaching climate change. It included a holistic vulnerability assessment, included a synthesis of the science, and then it looked at different sectors and assigned clear leads and responsibilities within those sectors with key strategies and sub-strategies that those leads would enact. And in total, it was around 350 discrete, easily identifiable actions that the state should take to address climate change. Unfortunately, that came out right at the tail end of the Schwarzenegger administration, which hindered implementation. With the transition to the Brown administration, there wasn't direct follow-up on the climate adaptation strategy implementation. When the Natural Resources Agency did decide to update the plan in 2014, they renamed the update Safeguarding California, Reducing Climate Risk. And it took a very different approach to adaptation planning that was much less action-oriented and really sort of provided a lot of information, sort of an encyclopedia of different efforts and action going on within subject-specific areas. And instead of terming the things that the state should do as actions or strategies, it says that these are simply recommendations that should be considered by policy leaders, but doesn't.
So just one question: if you go on the slideshow mode, then we can see the slides better, I think.
Oh, it's not on slide. I push share screen. It says that I'm sharing.
Yeah, we can see the screen, but it's not in the slideshow mode.
It's not in slideshow mode. Okay.
Yeah, if you just click on play slideshow.
Is that better?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Cool.
So.
All right. So, my apologies. The Safeguarding California Reducing Climate Risk Plan. So it did not really build off of the template or continue any follow-up on what actions had been done. It did not create an actionable path or responsibilities to actually implement adaptation actions at the statewide level. So part of what Executive Order B-3015, which Governor Brown issued in March of 2015, directed the natural resources to create implementation plans for each of the policy areas in Safeguarding California 2014, so that there would be an actionable path forward, and we could hold ourselves accountable to how we were actually making the state more resilient to climate change. What also happened in 2015 was there was a whole slew of adaptation bills. I already talked about SB 379, the bill that required local and regional governments to do adaptation planning as part of their local land use planning. But there were other bills, one of which requires the Natural Resource Agency to update the state's adaptation strategy every 3 years. Since the 2014 plan came out in July, we're required to come out with an update to the 2014 plan in July of 2017 this year. So that's what we are working on right now, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that. As you can see, we have, so this with the 3 prior statewide strategies, we have a 2009 strategy that has never really been followed up on, what that included 350 discrete actions. A 2014 plan that did not continue any of the structure from the prior state adaptation plan. A 2016 set of plans that build off of the 2014 plan and introduce more actions, but don't have a clear and direct link to that climate adaptation strategy. And now in 2017, we're trying to make sure that we consolidate all of the work that's been done in the past 8 to 9 years in California around implementing adaptation strategies, and make sure that this process is good and institutionalized, so that we don't have discontinuity, that we don't lose work, and that we continue to make the state government accountable for making progress on its actions. So that's a big challenge, and well, in a lot of ways there are bigger things that we should be doing with this plan, like a comprehensive vulnerability assessment, for example, or some other issues. I think the key challenge for us is to make sure that our approach is a solid foundation for these broader needs for the state moving forward. Max, is this working okay with the slides now?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
Great. So before I mentioned the different policy areas that are covered in these adaptation plans, and just to give a sense of these sectors, as we call them, I put them up in this slide. And I've organized them into 2 categories here: natural and working lands and water, and social and built infrastructure and communities, because this is a new approach that we're going to try with this 2017 update, to try to integrate some of the planning that goes on within these areas. And there's reasons why we've chosen these categories. One I'll mention is that we're trying to align the adaptation work better with the mitigation work. So for example, natural and working lands is a chapter in the scoping plan, which lays out the state's strategy to get to 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions levels, or 1990 emissions levels by 2030. So by grouping some of these policy areas that have been worked on over the years. Together, we can better align them with the actions that are ongoing in the mitigation side. And we also want to bring more focus on this social and built infrastructure and communities side. As you can see, the emergency management plan was only started in 2014, so they haven't had very actionable recommendations so far, and in terms of the state's adaptation strategy. Energy and transportation were a combined chapter in the 2009 plan, so breaking them out has allowed us to spend a lot more time thinking about what needs to be done to make those two policy areas more prepared for climate impacts. And then this land use and community development sector is really meant to tie to this idea that we need to be doing a better job providing guidance to local and regional governments around land use. We need to be thinking about how to build resilience within communities through state policy, and think about the social aspects of resilience to climate change. So these sectors are also not really a very good framework for holistic adaptation planning. I will say, as you can see, emergency management is a type of planning activity. Forestry is a management activity for natural resources, water included. These are not coherent concepts. They're different types of categories, so it's hard to work within these without finding a lot of overlap. I think the reason why these are helpful within state government is that they directly apply to the responsibilities of discrete state agencies. So there are lead agencies for each one of these sectors, and then those lead agencies are responsible for coordinating and working with the other agencies in that sector to actually implement the needed actions. And that's a model that is still developing, and we're trying to figure out how to better ensure coordination and implementation across the sectors. But I think it's important to stick with these policy areas by now from the last 8 to 9 years of so we need to also.
Joey, we have problems with your audio. I think you just covered the microphone or something.
How's this?
That's better. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Another reason that we've grouped the sectors in this way is to mirror the International Panel on Climate Change's fifth assessment, which looked at different impacts of climate change. We're trying to align what the state of California is doing with the way that research is being done at the international, national, and state levels as well. And this slide just sort of shows how we're trying to integrate each of these chapters into our holistic strategy. And we're really going to be laying out a high-level vision with chapters on research and resources and local and regional action alongside these large categories of natural and working lands and social and built infrastructure. So that's something we're excited about presenting and exploring how that helps us communicate these issues. Speaking of research, there's some really good supporting work going on across the state. the California's fourth climate change assessment, a series of 50 research projects that the state is coordinating to support climate change adaptation action. The state is funding two different portfolios of those 50 projects. One portfolio is focused on energy and energy infrastructure, and that's being coordinated by the Energy Commission here, and they've put together a whole range of scenarios and models, selected the best GCM or global circulation models, as well as California-specific wildfire models, land use projections, population projections, to really give a great standardized set of scenarios that we should use when planning for the future. And I think that's a really exciting, underrated step that the state is undertaking. That's really connected to caladapt.org, which I mentioned earlier is a website portal for visualization and hosting climate data. Local governments can use it to look at heat impacts, sea level rise, snow level or snow and precipitation changes, wildfire risk changes. It's a really neat tool for local governments to use, as well as the public, to understand what climate impacts are going to be. And then the adaptation planning guide helps people walk through how to respond to some of the impacts that they're seeing on caladapt.org. The state is updating caladapt.org. If you go to beta.cal-adapt.org, you can see some of the new, better downscaled scenarios that we've been working on that are also part of the fourth climate change assessment. And that caladapt.org portal is going to be also a source for a lot of other information, guidance, and as well as log of best practices going on, taken from local governments, and is going to be something that throughout the future really reflects the best science and practices going on in California around adapting to climate change. Another big related initiative is the sea level rise guidance document, which is being updated to address new sea level rise projections. Obviously, a huge issue across the world, and California is looking to bolster how communities plan for sea level rise. Julia is doing a lot of related work around that issue, and she's probably a much better expert than I am. But I'm happy to answer questions about that. And we also have another bill that focuses on the technical and science side of this policy area, and which requires the state to put together a working group to actually go into the engineering manuals that the state uses to design water infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, as well as all government facilities, to make sure that those facilities are designed with future climate conditions in mind. And I think the technical approaches from those research projects really point to.
I think you're gone again, Joey. Is the microphone back now? Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I can. All right. Well, yeah. Let me know if it's not. If it cuts out again. I might open up this so you can let me know on the sidebar. And I just wanted to talk about how the success, the real successes have not been communicated adequately, I think, within California. The coastal support and leadership going on through our many coastal zone management agencies has been really impressive in terms of how to respond to sea level rise and helping local governments respond to sea level rise and plan for sea level rise impacts. Um, there are great scientists and researchers and engineers deep into bureaucracy doing things basically because they think that it's the right thing to do. There are really impressive climate change projections integrated into the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. California's Central Valley is an extremely flood-prone area, and what they've done is integrate sea level rise, changing snow precipitation mixes, as well as more extreme storms, and how that'll affect the current extensive state-owned flood management system there, and how we should target levee investments based on those projections, which I think is a really exciting project. The State Wildlife Action Plan has vulnerability assessments to climate change for pretty much every animal and plant species in the state. And they're building on those to include adaptation actions and how to target migration corridors and habitat based on climate change projections. The Community Development Block Grant Program, which is a federal program from the Housing and Urban Development Agency. We have great people within our Housing and Community Development Department that are working to make sure that we're integrating climate change into this assistance that goes to mostly rural local governments. One great example is that we actually won a competition that was a collaboration between the Rockefeller Foundation and the Federal Housing Agency to help recover from the effects of the huge rim fire in Yosemite, and that happened in 2012 or 2013. We got $70 million to use these block grants for an integrated suite of adaptation strategies that includes forest biomass management and utilization, as well as building up emergency and community safety in an integrated way. Those types of things are really exciting. The State Water Resources Control Board has come out with a draft resolution that includes really detailed analysis of what needs to be done across their permitting and regulation to prepare for the effects of climate change. I recommend looking at that. They're going to be adopting that in the next month. The collaboration within the energy sector, I think Adam will talk to you about the work that the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission here in California that regulates utilities, the Federal Department of Energy and investor-owned utilities in the state here are taking to collaboratively plan and invest in research to prepare for the effects of climate change on issues that haven't reached widespread public awareness yet, like ocean acidification. California is leading an international alliance to deal with the effects of ocean acidification, and we have a lot of research projects ongoing through the fourth climate change assessment and other initiatives on how we do this. And we're also focusing on how to leverage federal and state resources to county public health departments so that they can start preparing for climate change impacts. And I think the real takeaway here is that these actions haven't necessarily been taken because any statewide plan said to do it. It's because California has built a great network of people who collaborate, like the local and regional alliance that Michael works with. across the state. I think probably just as important or more important and impressive are these actions happening within state government. And the paradox of people trusting very good technical managers within the state of California who are using the best available science to do this work is that we haven't done a good job about communicating the real successes that have gone on. But because people don't notice it, and when they do notice, it's because of failures to do the right type of planning. I probably shouldn't say this, but the Oroville Dam looks like one of those issues where it's the exception, but because we're not communicating our success well, the dam safety and regulation element of state climate policy being non-existent gets emphasized rather than all the other work that's going on.
Joey, this is Max again.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think your computer has audio problems. I will just put you on mute later. I'm just gonna say we're coming closer towards the end of the Q&A. Just if you want to do, I know you have one more slide. I'm just gonna not pressure you too much. Just saying if you want to go ahead, so we can then go into the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry about the audio issues. I'll just go to the last slide here. I don't think I need to go into any of these except just touch on again the need for California to really build in the last 2 years of the Brown administration solid roles and responsibilities that will serve for a continuous base on implementing adaptation. And I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in the bigger picture and longer term. But making sure that we've integrated and are communicating our successes in a clear and accountable framework is the first step to getting there. So thanks, and thanks for sticking with the audio issues.
Thank you, Joey. I'm gonna mute you now for just for a minute, and then we can put you back on the microphone again in a second. So I want to thank you first of all. Thank you very much for sharing all this information with us. Also for covering topics that are not your home ground, that yet not maybe your daily bread and butter. I mean, the topics that Michael initially was supposed to cover, so much appreciated that you just leapt into that and covered the whole range of issues. I think it was very, very fascinating also. I mean, first of all, I think you gave us a very, very holistic overview of California state adaptation. And then in addition to that, you also mentioned some sources where we can go, where we can look further. I mean, the caladapt.org, I think this is probably a place where the participants of the tour can go really to prepare for next week. And then I also found it very honest of you to mention areas where things can be even improved. So even beyond what we have right now, you mentioned the challenge to be holistic when you have these siloed agencies or in the departments. And then also the challenge to communicate. And I think that's very interesting because this, of course, you need to have the support of people behind it. But you're right, what you said. You get into the news usually when something goes wrong, right? So this is kind of the rules of the game. And if everything is kind of sunny, nobody cares. So this is a challenge, obviously, especially with a topic like adaptation that is so let's say it's so maybe less tangible because you're further looking out and you're actually preventing disasters, but the media cares about showing disasters. So what is your take? How can we overcome that communication problem or challenge?
I don't have a great answer on how to communicate. I think ultimately, personally, the getting people involved in local government and having local governments engage in a much more collaborative process around these general plan updates, I think is a really great opportunity for people to understand the really complex systems that are at risk due to climate change, how climate change is going to flood their roads, cause more intense fires, cause impacts their energy, and really affect every aspect of their well-being and health and lifestyle. I don't know if the current division of responsibility with state and local government will ever allow for sort of a full understanding from the public, because there is this divestment to technocratic experts that in many ways works well, but I think when my slide, the paradox of good governance, technical success and the paradox of good governance, really is more of my personal view on just the weaknesses inherent in our system of local, state, and federal government in California and the United States.
Yeah, thank you. One thing, so now is the Q&A round, if you haven't noticed. So you can actually signal any time now that you have a question. You can raise your hand, you can ask a question in the question tool, or you can send me a question in the chat or to the general audience as well. So please feel free to go ahead. I noticed we have both participants from Europe here on the call, where obviously things are a little bit different, but then again, you adapt to the same changing climate. So some countries in Europe also experience increased heat, increased risk of flooding, maybe also increased risk of water scarcity. And then we also have participants from elsewhere in the US, where things maybe work also a little bit, but a little bit differently, because obviously California is very special in many regards, both from the physical conditions where it is on the Pacific and also the size of it, but then also on the governance and policy level, that it is just not the standard in the US either. So I don't know if maybe people want to share. Also, if you don't have a question, you can also share maybe your experiences, or also if you don't come from this policy and government background, but maybe come from a private sector background, maybe you want to mention something about ideas for integrating stakeholders and integrating different communities, meaning citizens, meaning businesses, meaning maybe also other groups in society into this process. So I see we have questions here, and it's from Amanda. And Amanda, I'm going to try to unmute you and see if your microphone actually works. Then you can ask your question right away. You're on. Well, if Amanda, if it doesn't work, I can read out the question.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry. So yeah, my question was basically, I mean, California is sort of, kind of known to in the U.S. always be kind of like one of the first to try new things or the first to kind of get things into action. So my question is, have you looked elsewhere? Have you looked somewhere to Europe, maybe to Germany, because there's a lot with the Energiewende here, or maybe even sometimes Texas, because they have a lot of, especially with droughts and everything, there's kind of a lot kind of going on in that area, that maybe you've looked to these other areas for some guidance in terms of making sort of policy decisions in California.
So now we can hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and I'll go over sort of a few things. One, in terms of California's climate leadership, there's the Under 2 MOU is sort of the catchphrase that we use here, but it's a coalition of subnational governments that California and I think Baden-Württemberg there in Germany started with other partners, and there's a growing adaptation component to that coalition's work, and we're working with a couple different networks to share lessons learned and how to do different approaches. That's been pretty general so far, and what we've heard so far is basically just a lot of envy in terms of how much resources California has and staff to devote to this issue, and a big piece is figuring out how to marshal and coordinate the large number of people that we have working on this and the high degree of public awareness comparatively to other places. I'm much more familiar within the United States of places where other states are further along than California in certain areas. The Georgetown Climate Center is a really great resource. We participate. Michael has been doing this for years, but coordinating through this climate center at Georgetown Law School. And they started tracking all state adaptation actions back in probably 5-6 years ago. And we look at what they've done. They just issued a set of recommendations to Maryland's state government that I think were really interesting. And reading that report, they point to California in a lot of different policy areas on sort of how Maryland can take next steps. And they also point to other states. And I think there's definitely some takeaways in terms of what we can take from other places. But like I said, in general, the big takeaway is not that we're necessarily further along in policy. I wouldn't say that we're lagging behind in policy in any place, but it's that we just have a lot of people doing this work, and I don't think we necessarily we have to figure out how to coordinate the people that we have to really maximize our potential, and that's something I think is almost a unique challenge right now, at least from my perspective, in trying to craft a message and create a coherent strategy for all of state government. And there are some, I'll go back, there are some great examples out there. New York just put out a great strategy. Colorado has a really interesting framework around adaptation. But again, they just don't have as many people involved yet. So if you get a chance to look at some of the stuff that California is doing, and then see parallels with the scope of what other governments are doing, I would love to hear about additional places to look.
So Joey will definitely do that. I mean, next week we'll investigate. Of course, we can't cover all the topic areas, not all the aspects of what you mentioned. I imagine we will do hardly anything on forestry. because we're mostly in the LA region and really in the urban areas. So there are, of course, trees, but it's not really the same. We're not going into the national parks that much, and so you kind of touched on the weak points of the planned trip in a way, but we'll definitely see a lot of coastal areas. We'll definitely see a lot of also areas at flood risk, and also we'll see, of course, water management and water scarcity adaptation. And we'll have a lot more people also on the tour, more people than are on the call now, so there'll be more perspectives, and we'll definitely feedback. I think we can maybe envision a follow-up call after the tour. You can tell me some dates later on after the call, and then maybe we can schedule something after next week. And I have one more question, because you mentioned this kind of jealousy or competition thinking in a way, and I've noticed that in the past there was always this competing between the mitigation and the adaptation lines in both in one department and among departments. And I wanted to know how you feel this is evolving, whether this is a thing of the past now, especially in California, of course, in your domain, or whether that's still something you encounter. I mean, where people think, oh, we should not put too much resources in that area because we need it in the other area.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't quite know how to characterize the response. I think on the communications front, people are coming around to being able to look at the big impacts that we're experiencing from climate change now in California. Before, there was definitely resistance to saying, we can't say that there are going to be inevitable impacts from climate change when we're trying to get public support for mitigation, because that just undermines our case. And now people are realizing, no, there are impacts now, and that to avoid catastrophic impacts, we need to communicate with people. This is happening now, and we need to take these actions. So I think we're coming around on that. In terms of coordinating with the scoping plan, like I mentioned earlier, we have a long way to go in terms of integrating adaptation and mitigation. It's being done in silos, and I think one of the biggest issues is that we need to do a better job of taking these scenarios that were developed from the fourth climate change assessment that give a way to look at all of these interrelated issues between climate and land use, and figure out how to integrate those into all activities, including climate mitigation, because unfortunately that's not being done right now. And once we start integrating these scenarios and models with everything, I think that's a great step, and will give us the solid foundation to start to link the actions once we can share those base set of assumptions.
Well, thank you, Joey. This was actually very, very great closing words. We still have 2 minutes on this call, and I take pride in ending on time these webinars, because I know, like, you have to go into your day. For other people here on the East Coast, it's the closing of the lunch break, and then our colleagues or our fellows in Europe maybe want to end the day at some point. So I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I mean, first of all, of course, thank you, Joey. This was really great. I really learned a lot, even though, and I have to say, I did some research before, obviously, because of planning for the trip, but still, I learned a lot. It was really great to see also, to hear this from somebody who really knows all the different aspects, who has an overview perspective and can really also link these different strands of the adaptation policy world, and then also hear some maybe insider also ideas for improving or learning or growing even beyond what you have right now. So that was very, very much appreciated. Thank you, Joey. Also, thank you to all of you for dialing in, for taking the time, for asking questions. Amanda, much appreciated. As always, I'm really sorry for those of you who can't join next week. This is, of course, something we will share some of the experiences later on, and also hopefully then have follow-up calls, webinars with Joey. It would be great if you can take the time again for follow-up, and then maybe Michael can also join. We'll see if that works out time-wise. And then we have, of course, other webinars to follow on that. Again, this webinar today is being recorded, so you can follow or rewatch it later on, and maybe also on your flight over to California, if you are. So I hope to see you then next week. I see one more question from Amanda. Oh, no, it's just a comment saying thank you. Well, thank you, and have a great day, all of you, and let's be in touch, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.